Good evening, friends, and shalom. Blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. I want to go ahead and thank anybody who might currently be with us. Sorry, I'm going to go ahead and put my phone onto data. That way it's not using my Wi-Fi. I do have my Ethernet cord in, so I don't know if that's even something that's necessary anymore. But always want to make sure we have the best possible show. Anyways, thank you guys who are here for being here. I very much appreciate anybody who is here. So far, I do see YEC Rawmat in the live chat. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate you, sir. This is going to be a real fun one, I think. So you'll be quite pleased. Shalom to Cheryl as well. And of course, anybody who hasn't quite added themselves yet, don't worry. I will definitely be, saying hello and all that kind of stuff when I see y'all. We got a very interesting episode for you guys today, but before that, we obviously want to get into some of our channel housekeeping stuff and get that out of the way. So if you are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. If you enjoy this content, hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. And when you share this video, please do consider sharing this video to alternative social media platforms, even if you don't consider yourself right-wing or traditionally conservative or anything like that. The thing is, these websites are not meant for conservatives, right? They're meant for people just like yourself of all different political, ideological, philosophical, religious flavors, right? It just so happens they're dominated by right-wing right now. But if we get more and more people who are not right-wing on there, then it becomes less and less of an echo chamber and more what we actually want, which includes you guys. And I'm talking to people who would not consider themselves conservative. And that is a liberated space online, right? We're all tired of Facebook. We're all tired of YouTube. We're all tired of Twitter. We hate all the censorship. We hate all the policing. Well, do something about it, right? And here's how you can do something about it. Go to Parler, go to Minds, go to Gab. You only have to choose one of them, really. Get an account. Start using that account at least as much as you use whatever its equivalent is, right? And yeah, if you get there, follow your boy. Share this video. That'll certainly be fun. We don't have much to announce as far as what's coming up in the future. Hopefully, we got a lot of stuff that we're going to be setting up. But you guys know we're trying to get Kenny, Dr. Kenny, and Kenny Rhodes, for those who don't know, and Chris Date back on. Chris Date back on Dr. Kenny on for the first time. So we'll see whether or not that ends up happening. We have confirmed amongst the three of us that all of us are intending on making these things occur. It's just a matter of getting it scheduled, right? I'm going to do an episode at some time this month, probably closer to the end of the month, on Halloween and whether or not Christians can be celebrating Halloween. It won't be on Halloween because on Halloween, we're going to have a Reformation Day open mic special starting at 2 p.m. my time, might even be as early as 12 p.m. my time. I'm not 100% sure, but we're going to be going all day talking about the Reformation, talking about Reformation Day, talking about why it was such an important moment in Christianity, all that other kind of stuff. If you guys are interested for that, that'll hopefully be a doozy. That's going to be October 31st, which is the day the Reformation occurred, Reformation Day in Reformed circles and those circles which celebrate. And yeah, if you guys are interested in that kind of stuff, that's going to be a super fun episode on October 31st. And again, before that, we're going to do an episode on whether or not Christians can celebrate Halloween. I'm also going to do a response. He kind of revealed who it was, so I'm not going to be secretive about it anymore because he was here last night. I'm going to do a response to a Dr. David Falk video that he responded to me in. I think that'll be really fun. There's a lot of things I want to respond to Dr. Falk on as far as disagreements with the chronologies and Egyptology and stuff like that, but I think this will be a good thing to step into discussions with Dr. Falk, even if they are back and forth responses rather than a straightforward discussion, right? Especially considering the fact that I would be trying to get him at his wheelhouse, not the other way around, right? So it could be potentially dangerous. But then again, I've tried to slap people in their own wheelhouse before. I don't literally mean that, right? I'm just joking around. But, you know, Richard Carrier and David Fitzgerald, a couple of PhDs. But nonetheless, that'll all be fun. We're going to be talking on that instance. I'll be responding on something you said about literalism, actually. It's a response to my video on Randall Rouser in Exodus 32. So I think that'll be a good conversation to have. That's about all we have for announcements on this channel, but I do want to remind you guys December 27th on The Gospel Truth, which, by the way, you should be subscribed to The Gospel Truth if you like Christian debates and are not yet. But on the Gospel Truth, I'm going to be debating Sentinel Apologetics Rob Rowe on the question of whether or not the Bible allows for death before the fall. I take the position it does not. He takes the position that it does. And that's definitely going to be a great conversation. It's going to be December the 27th. And not only should you hit a reminder for that debate if you're interested, but also definitely go ahead and give Marlon Wilson, the Gospel Truth, a subscribe if you are interested in specifically Christian and religious debates, because that's what his channel hosts. But absolutely fantastic channel. I love it. I've been on. This will be the second time now. But even if I was never on, it's still an absolutely fantastic channel. So with all that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump into our prayer now and then get into the episode we have for today. So those of you who, of course, would like to join me, certainly would recommend that you do so. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for the opportunity again to make this video and to be able to study your word and the history of your Bible, Lord Jesus, history of your people, to be able to see the demonstration of your existence and power throughout history, Lord, and throughout all the other different tools that we get to use here, Lord, like philosophy and science, and those won't be the things of today, Lord, but it's such an amazing thing to be able to see. I thank you for that, Lord. I pray that you anoint us with the Holy Spirit today, that we may only lead people in general, Lord, to what you want us to know and to the revelation of your will, Lord Jesus. I pray that we get revelation from you today, Lord Jesus, in the way that you like to teach it, Lord. In Jesus Christ's name, we give you the glory. Amen.
Amen.
All right. My brother Jonathan Sheffield is here with us again today. Shalom. How's it going?
It's going pretty good, Jay. Thanks for having me on your channel again. It's great to talk with you again on these subjects.
Absolutely. For those who don't know, Jonathan Sheffield is actually a relatively old friend of the channel, as far as back in, I think it was 2018 is when I had my first interview with Mr. Sheffield, and even that was coming a year later than it was actually supposed to. We were going to be talking quite a bit before that, but there was a lot of trouble with internet and stuff at that time. I was really low quality. Yeah, so this is sort of a, what would I say? I guess a running relationship as far as the YouTube is concerned, and very good reason for it. I personally believe that Mr. Sheffield is the top out of the up and coming apologists, and believe me, there's a lot of good ones, right? I know because I'm involved with talking to all y'all. Some of y'all are even watching this right now, right? My personal opinion, but nonetheless, your primary wheelhouse is, of course, textual issues and history, right? So for those who don't know, go ahead and give a little bit about that and what it is that you do on your channel and in your apologetics.
Okay, well, thank you, Jay. And once again, you were too kind. But over the last, probably about 5-6 years, my ministry has been dedicated primarily to defending the reliability of the New and the Old Testament. Primarily focusing on textual criticism issues and defending the reliability of the text of the New Testament. And in that time, I chose to actually put together a host of 2D and 3D animations to kind of help break down some of the technical content of those subjects and make it more appropriate to help understand for, a regular audience. So you don't have to be a top scholar or anything else. I try to make the content easily digestible for all. So now, in that time, I've had the opportunity to sit down with a number of the scholars on the other side that takes the opposing position, to include Dr. Bart Ehrman, Dr. Richard Carrier on several occasions, Dr. Robert Price, Dr. Goodacre, and even Matt Dillahunty. So my ministry has been primarily defended for not only the text of the New Testament and the Old Testament, but also some of our core doctrines as well.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. And by the way, guys, I am going to be dropping the link to Brother Jonathan's channel right now in the live chat. I'm just absolutely awful about setting up my actual descriptions, and so most of my videos have like literally no description in them at all. But nonetheless, there is the channel there for you guys if you're interested. You should be interested, but nonetheless, So today's specific topic is in regards to a technically, I guess you could call it a series of debates at this point, since it was two, with Dr. Richard Carrier. Actually, really quickly before I jump into that, I just want to acknowledge some people in the live chat. Cryptomaria, Not Evolution, Jerome M, Richard, Neil, shalom to all of you. Thank you for being here. I hope I didn't miss anybody there. Thank you guys very much for being here, participating in the live chat, all that. By the way, those of you who don't decide to participate in the live chat, it's obviously, nothing against you. I just don't know your name, right? So I can't shalom you by name. But nonetheless, I appreciate you guys being here as well. So we're talking today about a series of conversations you had with Richard Carrier, one on his blog and one with Derek Lambert on Myth Vision, talking the authenticity of Daniel. And this actually follows a debate you had teaming up with Dr. Stephen Boyce against Drs. Jim Majors and Josh Bowen on the same question. That was over on Modern Day Debate, I think 2 or 3 months ago. Not too long ago at all, though. So tell us a little bit about the context of the conversation we're having today, and where you were trying to go with the Carrier conversation.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jay, for that. And once again, the goal of the discussion with Dr. Carrier was to really build on my previous arguments from the debate with Dr. Jim and Dr. Bowen, with the special emphasis on Josephus' report on the presentation of Daniel to the Macedonian king Alexander in 332 BC. So my engagement with Dr. Carrier was to pursue the thesis that Josephus' report presents the simplest explanation as to why Alexander did not capture Jerusalem. To that end, my goal was to kind of outline the circumstantial and direct evidence to basically establish a set of substantial facts from which one could logically infer and corroborate the fact in question. I think, one of the things that myself and other scholars have noticed that it seems strange that Alexander the Great did not initiate a conquest of Jerusalem or install a Greek occupation in Judea. Given the data that we had available and some of the reports that come out of that period. Interesting enough, we also have another report from Josephus in his Antiquities that also touches on the survival of Jerusalem at another juncture in its history, which, if true, appears to explain why Cyrus the Great, issued a decree to return the Jews back to exile, allowing them to rebuild their temple and their city walls against mounting pressure from a number of disparate nations to halt the fortification of Jerusalem. So what we see, at least in these two particular instances, is that in most cases, the Jews were the enemy. So all of a sudden, under the reign of Alexander and Cyrus the Great, how did the Jews and their God become the friends? And, what I wanted to do in this overall argument is because we're looking at two particular junctions in history. And if you think about it, the book of Daniel is specifically concerned with the catastrophic events in destiny of the Jewish people. It's actually advocating, here's what the destiny of the Jewish people are going to be. So what was interesting to explore was the background argument to this whole thing, because these two points in history is indicative of a larger trend that we see throughout the history and destiny of the Jewish people. And which is why, I want to pursue a much longer thesis with Dr. Carrier that I was able to publish on his article that really talks to the survival of the Jews, their resistance to destruction, their endurance under absolutely peculiar conditions, and the faithful role played by them in history, which seems to kind of point back to this particular mysterious foundations of their destiny. And so I wanted to explore that more argument, because it's not only how do we explain these two events, how do we explain the history of the Jews? So hitting Dr. Dr. Carrier with this argument is, well, okay, well, we have Daniel, we have Isaiah. These two books actually represent two observable black swans at these particular points in history that we can explain these events. But we kind of continue to see this throughout the history of the Jews. And in my article, I really wanted to spend a lot of time opening up with this background argument to show that the naturalistic worldview has a very difficult time naturally explaining the history of the Jews. And I sort of take the whole article, which is about 7,500 words, take them through this. What other well-educated, learned men had also observed throughout history in relation to the Jewish people. So in a nutshell, that is the basis of what I wanted to lay out in this discussion. Oh, I think you're mute, Jay.
Sorry about that, guys. And thank you for that. And by the way, we're going to provide links to both the article and the actual conversation they had on Myth Vision, as well as Dr. Carrier's response article too. But we'll also be kind of reading over a lot of that stuff and looking over it today in the course of this conversation. But obviously, a couple very interesting points that have been made there that we can already kind of jump into. Now, one that I think is very interesting, this is even the catalyst for one of my recent episodes. For those of you who watched the episode, how anti-Jewish conspiracy theories are evidence for God. The reason I actually made that video, or the catalyst, if you will, for me making that video, was I used to debate a lot of the anti-Zionists and stuff like that, right? Which, by the way, they're just the worst people on the internet, right? But nonetheless, I'd actually like approach them from an intellectual perspective and see what they had to say, and a lot of that, right? And a lot of their arguments had to do with exactly what Dr. Sheffield is talking. Or wait, are you a doctorate?
No, not a doctorate. I have my master's, but not in this particular field of study. So,
sorry, my apologies. I think I've been used to talking about so many different doctorates so far. I knew you had education though, so that could have been that too. Anyways, not the point. Mr. Sheffield will go with. Talking about all the different, basically destinarian kind of things, right? A lot of these anti-Zionist neo-Nazi types, they'll point out, they're like, how does 0.02% of the population win 23% of the Nobel Prizes? Or how do they own 50% of the world's wealth? Or how are they in control of 90% of our media? And if you have a skewered perspective, that is evidence for a conspiracy. But if you have a biblical perspective, it's actually exactly what you would expect. And that's basically the point of your article, only as it pertains specifically to the history of Daniel. And I found that incredibly interesting. Now, let's go through a couple different instances of that destinarian aspect of Jewish history in this time period, right? And I think probably the best thing to start with, just because it's the thing that kicks everything off as far as this period is concerned, is probably the rebuilding of the temple. So it's just shortly, in around 516 BC, we have pretty important things occur. What might those be?
Well, first and foremost, obviously, we have Cyrus Great coming into the empire. The Jews had just been exiled, or have been living in exile under Babylon. It's quite interesting because with the Babylonian Empire, basically took all them. Their policy was a little different than the Assyrians before them, who actually deported people. So the Babylonians were a little different, and they kept them kind of all together, which kind of helped things out a little bit for them. But then you have Cyrus coming to power. And what's interesting about that is we do have some information from Cyrus from his prison, and we got some comments. And what's interesting about that information is he's addressing primarily the areas of the old Babylonian Empire, he's addressing them as individual city-states. So, basically don't reconstitute yourself. You guys are now all independent. I recognize you as independent. Don't try to realign against me. So he's addressing wealthy nation states at that particular point in time, and he promotes an overall view of religious freedom. Now, what's kind of interesting is in all these states of exception, so the building of the empire, what you have here is the fact that for a king or a conqueror like Cyrus Great, who are going to be your friends and who are you going to be enemies. And what's interesting in this scenario is first, you have the Jews. If the Jews do not go back, and I do quote Mary Ellen, who is an English writer back in the earliest 20th century. But she said the world basically lays before us in this procession of the Jews back, because once again, if the Jews do not go back from Babylon, they basically just become intermingled in the East. Basically, the fate that elides them is basically what happens in, prior to the to the Northern Kingdom. So you have all that happening. In addition to that, so if they don't come back, you don't have Judaism, you don't have Christianity, you don't have the rebuilding of the temple. So what's interesting about the decree that we see kind of discussed in Ezra is the Jews are allowed to go back. Remember, there's people already in that area, and what happens is they come back into the area. There's people that are very upset about it. Lots of nations kind of appeal to the Persian court, and they ask them basically, hey, can you stop the refortification of people? Don't you realize what happened with the Assyrians? They're going to rebuild their fort. They're going to be rebellious. They're not going to pay taxes. They don't get along with their neighbors. But the Persians side with them. Obviously, Darius afterwards sides with them as well, allows them to continue the rebuilding of the temple. Their land becomes prosperous. And despite all these complaints against a number of other nations that you would assume that would be more valuable to Cyrus the Great, such as Tyre, you talk about the Canaanites, the Lebanese over there. He's dependent on their naval. He decides to side with the Jews. They even threaten, hostilities against anyone that's going to impede their progress. But I think what we got to understand, if this event does not happen, there's no Judaism, there's no Christianity, there's no rebuilding of the temple. So this is a major juncture in the destiny of the Jewish people. If this doesn't happen, all of a sudden there's no Judaism, there's no temple, there's no Jesus to go visit the temple. That's the end of Christianity as well. The setting is not ripe for Christianity to come in if you don't have that. So there would never be a unified state as we know it. So I'll kind of stop there to kind of talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, excuse me. I am still getting over a cold, guys. So if I have brief coughs and stuff, I apologize. So let's let's get into a lot of the details of that, right? Because first and foremost, a lot of us who have read the Old Testament would kind of already be familiar with at least some of the details of this, right? Obviously not all of them. One of the things that immediately stands out is, though Cyrus the Great is known for being generally tolerant, as you had said, there is seemingly a certain fondness both him and his son Darius end up having for the Jewish people. That it seems to be greater than all the other different peoples. For example, we don't see these incredible building projects being undertaken, in places like Turkey or Egypt or the other places they happen to have dominance. Is there any secular historical reason that people provide for that? Just one moment.
Oh, say that again. Sorry.
Yeah, my apologies. No, sorry. I didn't even notice that you had muted yourself. My apologies. So I was just asking. So what is the secular understanding of why it is that Darius and Cyrus have this seemingly positive predisposition towards the Jewish people? And hang on, real quick before you answer that, I noticed a few more people. Kelby Cuello, thank you, Jesus. Dwayne Burke, shalom to you all. Thank you very much for being here. Just want to acknowledge people in the live chat. Anyways, continue on with the answer there.
Well, I think what Carrier did is, one of his observations, which at face value I would agree with, that obviously, Cyrus the Great, being the political genius that he was, wanted to go ahead and, his intent is on preserving his empire, not causing really any commotion. Let's go ahead and give these dispersed people across the empire to return their gods to them, bring back what they'd lost, return their people, and kind of grant religious freedom for all, with the idea that it'll be easier to govern them, give them a sense of their own sovereignty. Obviously, you don't want the Babylonian empire to reconstitute itself, who actually had power to kind of put pressure on the Persian Empire. So let's give everyone sort of what they want. It makes them easier to govern. We don't have to worry about them. But here's the thing, and I think we see this always. There's obviously people that you're going to appease by your policies, and there's going to be people that are upset. It's one thing, and I want everyone to understand that most people at the very beginning of this return to Jerusalem, this was a small minority of Jews. Ezra indicates there's about 40,000 people that initially go back. Most of them are poor. Most of the people wanted to stay in Babylon because they were doing well. They had acquired wealth. So if you think Cyrus is going to do anything for anybody, why not the wealthy Jews who actually contribute and maybe set up a temple in Babylon for them? But no, this was a small minority of Jews. So it's a minority of a minority going back to an area that people already came into the area. And then what we see here is this sense of entitlement from the Jews that they had prerogative over the land. They were able to tell the Samaritans, the people that were there, the Lebanese, hey, get out. No, you can't worship at our temple. Go refer to Cyrus's inscription. No, this is for us. We're going to be doing it. But not only that, which is strange to begin with, but the Persian treasury funded the whole thing. Not only do you give back what you just conquered from Babylon, so instead of dividing up the gains from your conquest, and remember, the Jews weren't part of helping the Persian Empire sack Babylon. So all of a sudden, they're getting some of the booty or the loot from that campaign. They're giving back to them, and then they're financing the entire project, not only to allow them to perform the sacrifices, and because these people that are coming back were very poor, but they were financing, the building of the wall, the foundations, the sacrificing. They were actually taking tribute from other areas and feeding it into this particular project. And you have people that were very upset. So if you think about the Lebanese, people that were very upset. So you would think he needs the Lebanese to do it. So it's one thing to have a policy for all, but remember, this is part of the Persian propaganda. It has really nothing about religious freedom for all. It's about preserving the interests of the Persian Empire. And one of the things I pointed out in my article is this idea, because Dr. Carey was like, well, what Cyrus says in his inscription, well, it means what it says. Well, never means what it says. I mean, when the Roman Republic was out there siding with the Jews, on the notion of promoting republic ideals and protecting the freedom of the Jews against the Secludian Empire, had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with breaking down that empire and bringing wealth into Rome. So this idea that, well, we're going to just take him at face value. No, he didn't want the Babylonian Empire to reconstitute itself and pose a threat. And in these situations, there's people you have to side with, and there's people you have to repress. And the interesting thing, you have a very small minority of Jews coming back against much larger populations in the area, such as the Lebanese and the Samaritans and the Babylonians. All these people are very upset. And think about it: what king allows you to say, "Hey, I already know that you're probably going to be a rebellious people. I'm going to allow you to rebuild your walls and your defenses and your fortifications, and then eventually you're just going to rebel against me, and now I'm going to have to fight against that. I don't have no occupation in the area, nothing. I'm just going to allow you to do that." I mean, who does that? um, so what we see is we see the Jews getting all these benefits, and the other people weren't. And their only way to explain it is, oh, he was just nice to everyone. But well, if the empire was doing that for everyone, they would have no money coming in from anywhere because you have to pay for all these big projects for everyone in the empire. But we basically and obviously they did have a sense of religious tolerance. But what we see here with the Jews is much different, which allows us to beg, why were they the friends? A small people that didn't have any power or any interest to Cyrus in terms of they had no money to give him at the beginning. So you're going to spend all this money. So whatever money they do get, they'll eventually pay back. Why build their walls? So um, it seems a little too nice. So what explains that gratitude over all these other nations that you actually need?
Yeah, and especially when you consider that, the other cities around that you could tie yourself to, like Babylon or Thebes or something like that, would be so grandiose for you, but you choose Jerusalem, which seemingly in the eyes of the rest of the world at the time is probably not that grandiose. It's like this little, it's a big city, but it's this big city in a backwater country by the Mediterranean. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think the thing is, it always had military significance. It is the high ground. They do have water coming in to that particular area. Um, so if you think about any type of outpost, and what we see today is people always wanted that area. There was already people there when the Jews came back. So what you basically allowed the Jews do to kick out those other people, tell them they can't worship in your temple, and they were setting the agenda on everything. And where did they get that sense of entitlement that we can do this amidst all this pressure from all these other nations that he decided not to side with and threatened hostilities against if anyone impede these small people's progress?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, after that, of course, there's some interesting stuff we could talk about, but it is mostly pertaining to other books. So we won't get too much into some of the stuff with Xerxes and Esther and all that other kind of stuff.
Hmm. But the same
But
thing.
there is at least one portion of it that we do want to get to, right? Which is it does once again seemingly show this sort of destinarian theme, if you will, in the Jewish people.
Yeah, and I think you're right about Esther because what it shows there is that there was a segment of the empire that was hostile to the Jews. And when you look at Xerxes, and then you have this woman Esther, that that whole thing comes to an end, and not the Jews suffer, but the enemy. So there was this element within the Persian Empire that did not like the Jews. And so that's how I think the Book of Esther does help establish that there's this sense in the Persian Empire that did not like the Jews, and you have Cyrus making this decision, his son confirming it, confirming the records, and upholding the promise. And you have another element in there that wanted to take out the Jews. And what we see in Esther is it doesn't happen. Once again, under a very peculiar situation, they are spared and saved at a time where they wanted to take them out. And what actually happens is the reverse. All these other people get killed instead for their assault or intended assault on the Jewish people.
And another element I want to quickly comment on before we leave is this aspect that, they say, well, Cyrus is nice to everybody. And there's certainly, like you said, some truth to that. But even in what he and Darius after him as well, even in their seemingly, what would you call that, high favorability towards the Jews, that in and of itself, actually, as you pointed out, disproves that, right? Because the Lebanese, for example, and people in the Jordanian side, for example, the Samaritans who end up coming back with them, right? They don't actually get the same treatment. In fact, it's almost like they end up getting kind of worse treatment simply because they want to benefit the Jews, which is an interesting thing to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those people were bigger. You're talking about a small minority of Jews. The Lebanese, you're talking about Tyre there. If you think about you're going to give that land to anyone, obviously, why not people that help you? He's dependent on Tyre's naval. So the Jews had nothing to offer, and obviously not the ones that were coming back, the minority that wanted to come back. I mean, most stayed in Babylon because they were doing well. So you only have a small segment or a minority of the minority coming back. This is who you're doing it for that small minority. And what interest or what gain did he have during that particular point? Now, Carrier, during our live discussion, kind of changed his view because during the live discussion, he was like, well, it was a tactic of divide and conquer. I could see that. The problem is you still need the Lebanese more. You need the Babylonians and some of the others more than a small minority of Jews who couldn't really offer you anything.
Well, I would also point out too, even if you can say, well, like, yeah, you could say this was a divide and conquer and all that kind of stuff. One thing I kind of like to point out to people when they always talk about this kind of stuff is like, all right, and you know what I mean? Like, so like, for example, everything that happened with the establishment of the state of Israel, right? People can say, well, this was given to them by the UN or, British mandate wanted all this kind of stuff, or it was heavily influenced by what Hitler did in the Holocaust and, or, so on and so forth, all these different things. And you can just say, okay, the only thing that you're telling me is there was reasons we could see in discernible reality, but the impact or conclusion is still the same, which is for some reason, the Jewish people are benefiting from this and nobody else is. You know what I mean? And so I find it to be kind of almost a non-objection, even if it is true. You know what I mean? And very often it turns out not to be true, which is interesting in and of itself. But then we move on a little bit because there's a lot of, you wouldn't necessarily call them silent years, because
but they had no they had no violent attacks against them, and what I point out in the article is for a period of over 200 years under the Persians, and once again we see a lot of things with Jeremiah becoming the cupbearer, which is a prominent position within the Persian Empire.
Right.
There's coins being minted. There's correspondence that were coming out of the Persian Empire that shows, about the feasts of the Jews, and there's some real significance in the power of the Jewish people under the Persian Empire, and not only that, but they were kind of left alone for, even though you had these elements hostile to them, they were being surrounded by them. And then there was elements within the Persian Empire that was hostile to the Jews. They had a period of peace for a very long time under that, which allowed them to grow, reestablish their farms, their communities, to build up the area of Judea again, establish a sense of government and organization in preparation for what's going to happen next. So, yeah, very interesting. And I think a big takeaway is the Jews were always the enemy, and now all of a sudden they're friends.
Mm-hmm.
In light of perception that maybe I wouldn't want to be these people's friends. So,
and actually, one last thing I want to say before we leave, because this is an interesting thing. Josephus does report to us that Cyrus himself was actually shown, I think it's Josephus, that Cyrus himself was actually shown the book of Isaiah, and saw the Hebrew equivalent of his own name, which is his name in the Hebrew, or excuse me, in the Persian, I believe is pronounced Kurus. but it's Koresh in the Hebrew. And he saw the Hebrew version of his name in the text of Isaiah is one of the things that Josephus says to us. And so that's, if of course true, a very interesting element here. I certainly would not want to go against somebody who was able to show me my own name predicted 200 years before my birth, right? But actually, it does remind me, there is another element to kind of add there real quick, which is, it is interesting that Cyrus would likely be a Zoroastrian, and so would Darius after him, and Xerxes, and so on. And Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion that's very similar to Judaism in a lot of ways, which could cause them to have a lot of respect for Judaism in a lot of ways. And if you take both faiths at their face value, is likely influenced by Israelite religion. Because so according to the Zoroastrians, Zoroaster received his first revelation 258 years before Alexander, which would be sometime between 590 and 588. And according to the book of Daniel, Daniel would be made Belteshazzar after interpreting the dream in, I think, the third year of Nebuchadnezzar, which would be 603, 602. Which means if you just take both faiths at face value, it appears that Zoroaster has heavy influence from Daniel, and then goes on to have heavy influence on Cyrus, who then goes on to, allow the Jews to rebuild their temple. And it's a very interesting thing to look at when you're talking about, destiny, seemingly. And bear in mind, guys, when we use the word destiny, we are talking about the hand of God. It's just we're using a secularized term for the sake of argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then we move on, right? After this 200 years of peace and prosperity under the Persian Empire, relative freedom, even some pretty decently high status. And then we get to the point where the son of Philip, Alexander the Great, decides that he wants to conquer literally everything. And so he moves forward and, of course, ends up taking up the entire Persian Empire and individually going into cities in Egypt, in former Babylon, in Turkey, in Persia, so on and so forth. When we get here, what is the focus of the article? What is the arguments we see for a destinarian nature for the Jewish history?
Yeah, and I think once again here we see, another state of exception. A new empire is coming into being, and Alexander, once again is determining, okay, who are going to be my friends and who are going to be my enemies. And it's interesting because when he comes to Tyre, it's pretty interesting that he obviously wanted to go into the temple in Tyre to kind of rally their god before him. And so if we think about this from the worldview of Alexander, Alexander coming in and sacrificing at Tyre would also send a message to Darius that, oh, maybe the gods are turning on me and they're siding with Alexander. So there's obviously a mental aspect to that as well. But what's interesting enough is the people of Tyre realize that, hey, this war is not over. It's far from over. Obviously, Darius is building a bigger army in the east. Yes, Alexander did great in the west, but he's looking forward to an army of 100,000 people in there. So, what we find in the text of Diodorus and Plutarch is, this idea that the people of Tyre wanted to remain loyal to Darius. The war wasn't over yet, and the idea of a Macedonian coming into Tyre, to try to rally the gods against Darius was a non-starter. It's like, we're going to take our chances. Tyre at that time, did have an alliance with Carthage, so they were kind of hoping for support over there too. They didn't think Alexander would be able to take Tyre given their position off the land. So this gives us insight into a Persian ally's mentality on, okay, well, we got Alexander coming in here. He's making all these demands, but we are still Persian allies. This war is not over. What are we going to do? And at that request, we can't do that. Now, what's interesting is we do have reports not only from Josephus, but we also have it from Origen as well, that there was a request from Alexander the Great to the high priest of Israel for resources. So if you think about it, Alexander is, he's having a siege. He's employing the neighboring villages into work because it's going to take a lot of work. He was employing thousands of people into enlisting to help him with this siege. Now, what's interesting is adjacent to that area is Judea, and one of the good things we have is we have some history from Hecataeus of Adira, who was a contemporary of Alexander and Ptolemy, about just how bountiful Judea was at that particular time. This is over 200 years after they went back to rebuild. They become populous. The city of Jerusalem is thriving. Lots of food, lots of resources, a lot of strongholds. So to see that Alexander, he's doing all this work, he has this big siege, he's employing people into this effort to help him, it's only naturally to assume that the state of Judah, which is adjacent to the area, had all these resources. He's going to need to supply his army, feed his army. They're going to need resources. He was bringing in mercenaries from the Peloponnese. As all these people, you got to feed them. You got to supply them. You need to bring in auxiliaries. So he makes this request, and from the report of Josephus and Origen is they stuck with Darius. They're like, wait, we made these oaths. He's still living. We can't break this. And then Alexander basically says, all right, once I'm done, I'm coming after you guys. So we obviously see what happens in with Tyre. And then all of a sudden he goes down to Gaza, which, if you think about it, is only 47 miles away from Jerusalem. It's they're basically on their footsteps. They probably hear them marching, you hear the camp down low. And what we have from the Roman historian Curtius is that when he got to Gaza, Alexander went out to people in the area that still didn't submit to the yoke of his rule. Who would that be? I mean, 47 miles away from Gaza is Jerusalem. You're talking about Judea is right there. So, which is consistent with Josephus's report that, Alexander made haste to go up to Jerusalem from Gaza. Perfectly consistent. What is the high priest going to do at that time to ensure the safety of his people? But obviously, have a procession of Jews come out to meet him halfway to see if any deal can be worked out. And what's interesting about this is not only do we have the report from Josephus, Origen, we also have Eusebius talks about this procession. We have the Jewish scroll of fasting. We have the Babylonian Talmud, and we even have Pseudo-Calathenes has this element of a Jewish procession meeting out with Alexander and the nations he was with, talking about. So there's a lot of independent attestation in the Jewish documents, as well as Origen and Eusebius, about this procession, which only makes sense. They were in the area, and what we can affirm is that at least from Pliny, Eusebius, and Arrian, Alexander was in the area. So if they were in the area, just like every other nation was trying to get in front of Alexander before he got to their city. I mean, we see this with Byblos and Sidon. Is we're going to come out and try to do whatever we can to stage off elimination. So what we have here is another fateful moment in Jewish history. You have a request from Alexander. You have a denial from a Persian ally, which is consistent with how Tyre responded. And then you have Alexander entering in the area. and obviously the Jewish high priest making an attempt to ward off elimination, because once again, the Samaritans are part of the sequence as well, because the report is they went to Alexander when the Jews had denied and said, "Hey, here's our opportunity for us to reclaim what we've been trying to get for the longest time." So it's very interesting that all of a sudden you have this fateful moment, and then you have a unique turn of events where the Jews are friends of Alexander given these circumstances. So, how do we best explain that? And I'll kind of keep quiet for there, let you jump into that.
Sorry, I accidentally almost pressed remove from stream instead of exit solo layout. That would have been bad. Anyways, well, I guess that would have been easy to solve. But anyways, that is an incredibly interesting thing for us to look at historically, because there's a couple important elements that we end up seeing. Number one, it relies on that understanding of history relies on an already existing book of Daniel, right? Because it is by showing Alexander the book of Daniel that he ends up being convinced that he shouldn't attack the city, right? But also, not only does it give us a 330, or well, I guess it'd be closer to 320, but nonetheless, general, existence of the book of Daniel, it also gives us this sort of understanding that it was seen as prophetic at the time, even by people who were not actually Jewish, right? Who are actually seeing this and presuming this is correct, of course, who are actually seeing this and saying, hey, this has a pretty solid understanding of everything we've seen beforehand, of what is happening now, and there appears to even be more to come in the future. And specifically in this instance, Alexander would be the brass kingdom and the goat, right? In fact, more specifically, the goat, I think, would be a little bit more obvious, right? But the brass kingdom is also supposed to be him as well. And it's fairly easy to see it. But the reason that I say the goat is more specific is because if you guys would recall in the audience, it actually says in the book of Daniel that this one-horned goat will come out of Greece, right? And so Alexander, he'd be looking at this and be like, well, I'm clearly the one-horned goat that comes out of Greece and smashes everybody lightning fast, right? And it almost, the argument relies on, like I said, not only this book existing, but it also being seen both by Jews and by pagans even as very obviously prophetic.
Yeah, and that's the point there that we have to look at, is the fact that in Josephus' account, obviously Alexander has always been fond of foreign gods. His men mocked him for it at Opus. He was willing to travel all the way to Libya to go out there and visit the shrine of Ammon, just with the hope that he would be, find favor with the gods over there and kind of reveal his kind of demigod status. So obviously, the Jewish procession, from what we see from the documents, is that he was very intrigued by it, which is consistent with how Alexander perceived the foreign god. He was very interested in them. So seeing the Jews come out clothes in white, and what we see, for a man of that age, the Jewish high priest would almost represent what the shrine of Ammon meant, in the sense that it's a communication with the god. So as the shrine of Ammon was a communication with Apollo, obviously the Jewish high priest and the mitre on his head would represent that communication to the gods. So obviously, in that case, there's a duality that exists. Okay, is the god here bearing gifts, or is he, come to destroy me? So obviously, coming into Jerusalem, and to sacrifice, he obviously wants to rally the god on his side. But what's interesting about the whole account is he's just there at Jerusalem. He hasn't made any decisions. He just comes in, he sacrifices to the gods. And what the Jews do next, according to Josephus, is the book of Daniel is brought out. And it seems to refer to chapter 8, because he says where a Greek is identified. And what we see in chapter 8 is the interpretation being expounded that, okay, well, here's who the goat is. It's going to be a Greek who's going to defeat the Persians. And Alexander believed he was that person. And then so he let them go for the day to give him a day to think about it. And then the next day he comes back, and this is what's in the account. And he gives them all these benefits. We see with the telling them free of tribute for the sabbatical year, the next year. We also find in the account where he offers the Jews to become allies in there. And then he offers them all these benefits where if you join my army, you can maintain your own gods. Imagine how the Greeks felt about that. And it's interesting because after Alexander leaves, the Samaritans are like, hey, we were here with you. Hey, what about our request for free of tribute? Because what's interesting is the very next year of the sabbatical year, we do see the Samaritans burning the governor of Syria. And Alexander has to step in, basically install a Greek occupation into Samaria. I mean, what would have made the Samaritans that mad that they were going to go ahead and burn the governor of Syria? Except this fact that, the Jews got free tribute and we didn't. And what's the difference between the Samaritans and the Jews? Well, the Jews have the book of Daniel, the Samaritans do not. And what's interesting in this case, too, is Hecataeus of Viterbo establishes that all these benefits were in there. He was part of the army where the Jews served. So you have this element where why would a Persian ally be serving in Alexander's army? And he does describe all these benefits that Alexander bestowed on the Jews, which shows that they had some prior relationship. What prior relationship is this? So if we look at the whole sequence of events, once again, there's no Greek occupation. There is one in Samaria. 3 years after Alexander dies, Ptolemy, takes Jerusalem. 3 years. And if you think about it, Ptolemy was there. He was one of the top generals under Alexander. So the nagging inconsistency I have is, what's the difference? Why does most military leaders listen to their generals? Why is there this difference of opinion in how Alexander treated Jerusalem? And just 3 years after his death, Ptolemy takes Jerusalem, takes a number of them, and Judea. It's like, that's weird. Was he upset about something previously? That he's like, man, we need to take these people, and you were just so nice to them. So, and it's funny because the report of Ptolemy was he came into the city. No one had no clue. He came in on a Sunday or on their Sabbath when they were all worshiping, where they weren't taking up arms. So he knew him quite well. And lastly, we see with Arian. Arian does confirm that a deal with the Jews was reached with Alexander. But why isn't he expounding on what actually happened? So you have all these sequence of events, which, if true, the book of Daniel best explains why the Jews got all these benefits. Alexander brought them over to Alexandria to give them equal privileges with the Macedonians. We don't see this with the Samaritans. We see his general, just 3 years after his death, take Jerusalem and Judea. Why are there differences? The book of Daniel explains that.
Yeah, and another interesting thing to see is whereas we have, for example, Samaria militarily occupied and Tyre destroyed and things like that, even in instances where Alexander is not like that, for example, when he goes to Egypt or when he goes to Babylon, we do see him strong, or even originally when he went to Tyre before he destroyed it, right? We see him very blatantly wanting to associate himself with these foreign gods, right? Like, oh, I'm a descendant of Hercules, and also I'm the great pharaoh, and also, but when he has the opportunity to do that in this very spiritually significant Jerusalem, right, he for some reason doesn't, which is very out of character, right?
He's not king of the Jews. Why wasn't he made king of the Jews? I mean, or high priest? You would think, okay, well, if the Jews made him high priest or king of the Jews, Yeah, maybe that kind of explains some of the benefits. But Pharaoh did. They met with him with all this gold. They came out to meet him on the way. And then obviously they gave him the answer he was looking for when he went to the Shrine of Ramon. So um, that, I mean, we have to explain these things. What explains the Samaritans' actions to all that rage-filled hate to destroy the governor of Syria just a year later in the sabbatical year, when we have a report that Alexander turned away their request for dismissal of the tribute in the sabbatical year, and then all of a sudden your archenemy, the Jews, get it. And what's the difference there, except they have the book of Daniel, you did not. You helped them, the Jews did not. So why would these friends who should have been the enemy get all these benefits, and the people that were trying to be the friends ultimately become the enemy?
Absolutely. And I think another thing that's also kind of important for us to note here too is even when we see Ptolemy take the city of Jerusalem, excuse me, it ends up still being a relatively benign taking up until a certain point, which we will certainly get to. That point is actually specifically prophesied in the book of Daniel. But even in the initial taking of Jerusalem, we see Ptolemy is relatively tolerant. He doesn't actually destroy the city. He allows the temple to be built. He doesn't associate himself with any of the, any of their religion or anything like that, or set himself up as high priest or anything. So even though he doesn't have quite as much of a positive disposition as Alexander did, he still, for some reason, has some kind of a positive disposition towards Jerusalem, which is, again, very interesting and kind of out of character.
Yes, it does. Obviously, there's a difference. He decided that a Greek occupation needed to be in there. He understood as a military general the significance of maintaining the high ground, which Alexander would have done too. I mean, remember, Alexander came in there as the new mob boss. I'm going to show these people. Remember, when he was in Afghanistan, in Bactria, there was a little rock up on the hill, but he couldn't let it go. He's like, I need to let those people know who I am. So, he had his men ascend, this towering rock just to let these people know this is what I can do to you. So the idea that he wouldn't have been concerned with Jerusalem is ridiculous. I mean, over in Afghanistan, yeah, this little rock, why are you concerned with those people? They can't do anything. But he needed to show them who was boss. And the fact that Judea was as big as it had all these resources. He was engaged in a 7-month campaign in the siege against Tyre. He wouldn't need resources. It would have been only natural to ask. And so you ask, you get denied. And all of a sudden, you're best friends with these people. What explains that? Now, obviously, a God that predicted his victories, he would see as a pretty powerful ally. So he is not a member of the Enlightenment period. He believed in the gods. He sought to rally the gods. He sacrificed to the god of fear in the Battle of Guadalajara. He understand his role as a servant of the gods. So obviously, a God that had predicted his victories, just like the other report with Cyrus, you would not want to offend that particular God. You'd want him on your side. So when we look at it from that perspective, it makes total sense why Jerusalem remained so well. And even if you look at the Secludians, which are the Macedonian army, the descendants of Alexander, they attacked the Jews. So you see a different insight from the generals than you see from Alexander. And what best explains that but this disposition of Daniel. And in this case, you have an observable black swan that you have to deal with. And what I find with a lot of the proponents that are against Daniel is they try to dismiss this evidence because they don't want to deal on what this means. If the book was there, not only it's a public appearance, but now not only do you have the Jews bringing it forward, but you have Alexander and his entire council that would have looked at that in the sense of like, this ain't a forgery. So that's the significance of it. They wouldn't have been fooled by a forgery. So they had to recognize what that was at that particular time and what it meant.
And so, and then after this event, we still have some more very interesting things that end up occurring. First and foremost, as we've already established, the empire splits, which is specifically predicted in the Book of Daniel. It splits into the Book of Daniel says the four corners, but which is a reference to east, northwest, and south. But it splits into two big kingdoms, which is the Seleucids, who base themselves in Babylon, and the Ptolemies, who base themselves in Egypt. And then we have I can't remember the names of the other two because they're just not really that important. But one of them who bases themselves in Turkey, and another one who bases themselves in Greece. Which from the perspective of the Jewish people, Greece would be to the west, and then the Turks would be to the north. So after this moment, we then see the Ptolemies take control of Jerusalem. Eventually, they start having a little bit of persecution towards the Jews. There's this gentleman, Onias III, who actually is the founder of what we would eventually know as the Pharisees. Although at the time they were not actually the bad guys, but they would be the good guys in this instance, defending the right of the Jewish people to actually worship their God. And so the Ptolemies start, having these persecutions. Onias does what he does, and very interesting things ends up occurring afterwards. Namely, the Ptolemies start to lose to the Seleucids, and they get it taken back. And so, again, we see this destinarian nature of the Jewish people. But let's go ahead and have you explain more than I just did on that. And also, doesn't the Book of Daniel actually specifically prophesy this?
Yeah, that's what's kind of quite interesting, and I think what's important for this whole sequence of events, as it's kind of narrating the history of the Jews, it seems to be following what the scriptures say. So we're seeing this trend that's happening, especially with the Book of Daniel, and then we kind of have Porphyry of Tyre recognize this. Now, I think the insight of Porphyry is the fact that he's an educated. He's from the area, so he's of the area of the Jews. I mean, being from Tyre, he was well educated at Athens. So he's an intellectual, pagan at that time. Just looking at his Aeneads, you get really this mind set of him. But what's interesting is he says all the history up until the time, of this whole Maccabean revolt, everything is good. So he didn't question any of the history, and obviously, as an educated member of the pagan world, he would have understood this. So I think what's quite interesting is he recognized, obviously, Christianity, huge expansion. Lots of converts, even amongst the Jews. He's probably upset about the God-fearers as well coming over into Judaism. But what he recognizes is the specificity of the historicity of this particular period, which then really goes into the sequence of events that start to befall the Jewish people and Jerusalem. So it touches once again on the survival of Jerusalem and the Jewish people at this particular event. And the big takeaway for me is once again, the Jewish people were able to defeat the Seclude army, another descendant of Alexander, coming in. But the historical details that lays out of him coming into the temple, defiling it, it's sort of that precursor to that kind of Antichrist view that's being laid out specifically in Daniel, that's getting ready to set up the next kingdom, to get ready for what's going to happen next. So it kind of lays out this entire sequence of events to get everything ready for when Christianity comes on scene. And here's where we get the attack. Porphyry recognizes the prophecy. So this is another pagan, intellectual pagan that realizes the impact of the book of Daniel on history. And once again, uh, this was being spoken in the Greek speaking synagogues throughout um, the Greek speaking world. The God-fearers would have been hearing this the entire time. And you only have Porphyry coming out at his particular time, coming out to attack it. So this is the first attempt, even though we had a number of God-fearers that was hearing that in the Greek-speaking synagogue, and they had no problem with the history or what had happened, and we have him attacking, and then all of a sudden, this is setting up for what's happening in getting ready to occur with Christianity, with the setup of with the destruction of the temple, and with the cutoff of the Messiah. So, pretty huge.
Absolutely. And some incredibly interesting things that I think are important here is that, we also, on top of the pagans back in the day recognizing this, but the modern historians also tend to recognize this as well, right? They know, all right, there's an incredible amount of detail from Babylon through Persia to the Greeks, to the split of the four empires, to even going into detail not only on the wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, but how Israel is switching hands, talking about Onias III, talking about Antiochus later on, right? And it's almost universally agreed at this point that everything that Daniel talks about, at least up to 150 BC, is incredibly detailed and accurate. And I would, of course, go farther than that. But the point is that even Richard Carrier would agree to that statement.
Yeah, and this is the problem that they have. It's very specific. It's where here we got an observable black swan. Here, it's incredibly predictive, but it's obviously going against our naturalistic worldview. We don't believe in prophecy, so it must have been written afterwards. And John Collins talks about this in his book. They picked up on this worldview. Okay, if prophecy is not possible, then it must have been written afterwards. And this is the basis for their narrative that they're trying to force on scholarship is, oh, it had to be written afterwards. We have all this other stuff that we can't explain, but this is too specific. No one could have predicted it. So we need to force our contemporary narrative on history. It had to be. And even though they like to attack the book of Daniel and try to make a big deal about historical reference, there is no historical reference of any person of any notability in Judea at that particular time writing this tome, especially at a period of war. It's obviously people running off the caves, they're trying to survive. Who has time to bring this in? There's no historical reference. So even though I make the point that they make a big deal about Darius the Mede, we obviously have persons of interest. We have Josephus' report on there. We have a figure known to Xenophon. But there's no one that they can point to at that period in the Maccabean history, even though we have the chronicles of the high priest at the time. We have the books of Maccabees. No one's aware of some book being circulated, even though the Jews were in a number of different segments. The Jews have not even attacked each other on themselves to say, no, that was invented. The Secludes themselves, the Syrian Empire, or a lot of their descendants were still around when Josephus was writing the Antiquities and published that. So obviously they would have been the first to put their hands up and say, hey, no, this is ridiculous. We were there at the time. Yeah, they promoted this big book. And for me, it would have made sense if they were going to add any book to the Orthodox Jewish canon, it would have been the Maccabees. That they can spin as God called us to do this. This is our first major win since King David. We are destined by God to do this. We beat the Macedonian army. It would have had a much bigger impact than a book of Daniel about some sage interpreting dreams. And I make this big thing about that in my original debate. That's the one they would have put in there, not the Book of Daniel.
And so one thing that I want to definitely get to, before we end, and I'm not saying we're close to the end. I'm just saying, I guess I'm not sure how far we're going to go, to be honest. But anyways, one thing I just wanted to definitely note is, since we all do agree up to that 150 point, and by the way, I did notice a comment of Kelvin Cuello. He said he thought that Seleucus, or Antiochus, excuse me, was Seleucid. That is true. The Ptolemies were the first to have a persecution in Jerusalem, and it wasn't nearly as bad. And that's when Onias III was responding to them. And then Antiochus had the one that ended up kicking off the Maccabean revolt, which is incredibly interesting, right? Because you even we talk about the abomination of desolation and the rededication of the temple, right? Even that is specifically prophesied in the book of Daniel. And of course, Jesus says later on that there is yet more to come of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, very often we get into this, sort of, what's the idea? This false binary where it's like it has to be one or the other, when clearly, I mean, even if you look at the way Jesus prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, right? It's a twofold prophecy, right? He answers both the question of when Jerusalem will be destroyed and when the world will be destroyed with the same line of events, implying that in both of these instances, the same line of events will happen again, right? And I think that's a very interesting thing for us to point out there. But nonetheless, even assuming that all of that was wrong and that was just my interpretation, we do see clearly him talking about the abomination of desolation, which Antiochus commits, the rededication of the temple, which we see in 164. And we know for a fact that this event ended up happening as portrayed not only in Daniel, but also in the book of Maccabees, because even at the time of Jesus, we see that the Festival of Lights is being celebrated. In fact, he celebrates it in the book of John.
Yeah. Which goes back to just how significant that event was in the history of the Maccabees. That's why if they were going to add any book during the Hellenistic times, it would have been that one. But once again, we don't see any of these additional works attributed to Daniel in the Orthodox Jewish canon. We see it in the Septuagint. We see the Hellenistic writings that come in, show up in the Septuagint. We don't see it in the Orthodox Jewish canon. If they were going to add anything to it, it would have been the book of Maccabees. That would have been the one they would add, but they still didn't, so that we can empirically see. We don't see him adding stuff. We see other books of Daniel. We don't see him adding stuff. So this idea that they would add it is just ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hold on 1 second, Jay. Hold on a second.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that meantime, actually, what I'll go ahead and do is do some channel housekeeping again. So those of you who are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to this channel if you have not done so. If you enjoy our apologetics, content, certainly do appreciate your support, your view. Hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. And by the way, if you're not seeing this live, please leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything of that nature that starts with the C. Drop that in the comment section below. That is certainly what it's there for. Also want to remind you guys that we are on various different social media. If you want to find me on Twitter, on Facebook, on Parler, on Gab, on Minds, just look me up at the Synagogue. You will be able to find me there. I'm on like I said, all 5 of those channels, and I use them frequently, platforms, and I use them frequently. So if you guys ever want to reach out in those particular ways, certainly do appreciate that. Also, if you guys are interested in supporting this apologetics content, please consider giving to the Patreon. Please only do so, though, if number 1, I have earned it. Number 2, it does not impact you in any way. And number 3, you feel led in some way, to do so. Certainly do want to express my appreciation for those of you who do contribute. And by the way, those of you who don't, I'm not saying that you're not appreciated as well. Just, obviously, to make this into a career, I do definitely need to earn it, and specifically earn it from you guys, right? And so those of you who feel that I have done so, and also have the means to do so, and also have decided to move forward with doing so, I appreciate you very much. And with that, that's perfect. No, that's perfect timing. I was literally just done with my whole spiel on my channel housekeeping thing, so that's actually perfect timing. Actually, one thing I will say real quick, because I haven't acknowledged some new people in the live chat for a while. So I do see Amped for Jesus and Craig Reed TCR. And I don't know if I already said shalom to Kelvy. Jamie Russell is here. And did I miss anyone else there? Shalom to all you guys, and I very much appreciate you being here as well. I think that's everybody. That would be because everybody else I had already acknowledged earlier. But nonetheless, appreciate you guys very much. And for Jesus has found you on a Hovind debate and are now following. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Always nice to have some new faces here, and I hope that this is edifying content for you. So a very interesting thing that we do have to address, since we've brought it up, is sure, we all agree up until 150, but what about after 150? Right? So let's go ahead and address some of the points that we have there. First off, do we see this destinarian nature of the Jewish people after 150? And second off, how does that argue towards the authenticity of Daniel?
Yeah, and once again, in my article, the book of Daniel is specifically concerned with the destiny of the Jews. It's basically its whole theme. We see, for the first time, this idea of interpreting dreams as mysteries, as an interpretation of historical events. So I think what's kind of unique about the book of Daniel is it kind of represents this philosophy of history that we look at, obviously, apart from a naturalistic worldview. And you have this sequence of events in the history of the Jews where, apart from a naturalistic explanation, we can't explain it. And when we look at the history of the Jews in particular, I mean, going all the way back, it seems to follow this overall narrative. And if you think of what everything was leading up to in the book of Daniel, you're talking about the coming of the Messiah. It really reveals, the coming of this Christ. We have the fourth beast being the Roman Empire. We see the destruction of the temple. So, people saying, well, yeah, 150, but we still have other events that we have to explain. The cutoff of the Messiah. Who would that fit during that time? We have the fourth beast with the Roman Empire. We have the destruction of the Jewish temple. Who does that fit? But obviously Titus in 70 AD. So while modern scholarship will keep it at 150 BC, they still have to explain all these other events that Daniel is prophesying that's coming to be. What best explains the events? We have Jesus coming on scene, and the impact he had on history. We see the destruction of the temple, and in 70 AD. And we never see it rebuilt again, which kind of goes back to Jesus's prophecy. We see the fall of the Roman Empire in 410, and it continues to. When we look at the history of the Jews, it continues to follow this. And in my article, I kind of tied back Isaiah because Isaiah has a big point in this whole matter as well, in relation to the destiny of the Jews. I mean, obviously, not only what happened in Assyria in 701, but what we find in Isaiah 10, which takes us all the way to 1948. So we can, where they, we have exiled people dispersed all over the land, coming back and reconstituting itself as a sovereign nation against tremendous hostility against six major armies that surrounded them. But once again, unbeatable odds, they prevail. So, when we look at the particular events, coming into Christianity, it all seems to be following what the scriptures are saying. We see a trend with all these points. And, when we look at that, at these independent variables, what does it point back to? And it seems to be following the scriptures. And that's what we see at these particular junctions in history. And I'll kind of just settle back and I'll get some of your thoughts on there.
Sorry, just a moment. I'm having a little bit of. There we go. Yeah, and I think that especially as it pertains to a lot of the Messianic prophecies, I think we see just like perfect description here, and of course leading up to the eventual destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 A.D., which you do see specifically referenced in Daniel as well. So it is one of those things where it's like, yeah, we can say, okay, at 150 we're going to go ahead and stop, but the thing is, it doesn't end up working out with the rest of history, right? And it even extends to farther than just the notion of, the Messiah and stuff like that. We seem to have specific reference to the Sixth Syrian War, to the Hasmonean dynasty, to the rule of Herod, even. You know what I mean? And so it seems like it's one of these things where it's like, okay, I know why you guys don't want to move forward past this point. There's a couple reasons, right? The first reason is because you just functionally can't. We know that Daniel existed by 150 because we have copies of it that date to around 150 BC. So it's just impossible to move forward beyond that, right? As far as trying to date it. But also, of course, if they start to concede these points, it's one thing to concede that Daniel may have gotten, let's say he got lucky, quote unquote. I obviously don't believe that, but let's just pretend that we're secularists and we say that he got lucky, right? That's one thing. But to be specifically prophesying the coming of the Messiah, well, now you end up basically conceding that Christianity is true, right? Because you have an Old Testament prophet who's actually saying specifically that this New Testament Messiah will be established, and then it comes to pass. So it's almost like something that can't be conceded by the opposition. Otherwise, they wouldn't be the opposition anymore.
Yeah, and you make great references because there's the coming of Herod, the Hasmonean dynasty. There's just so many elements that we can see in history or the manifestation of it in history, and it kind of points us back to, well, this is what Daniel was saying. Here's what's happening. It's following this trend, and it's not just one point. In the original debate with Dr. Josh, Dr. Majors, was, when I was bringing up about the book of Daniel with Alexander and with Cyrus, I didn't have the time to really expound on this. Daniel, we see all these, strange events occurring in the history of the Jews that seems to be following the book. So the book does exist, and there's no doubt that the book of Daniel exists. Jerusalem is real. We're not talking about Shangri-La, or some mysterious place. The Jewish people are real. Their history is real. And how do you explain all these junctures, except when you look at the scriptures, and particularly the book of Daniel, it seems to be following it. And that's something that I'm not saying that the secularists or the naturalists, they have to automatically jump to a God hypothesis, but are they actually engaging the observable black swan? Are they willing to engage it? And I think my problem is they're willing to dismiss it or come up with any other explanation, no matter how bad it sounds, to get away from actually engaging the observable black swan. That maybe my naturalistic presupposition doesn't square with what's happening here. And we got real people, real cities, real events that's happening. And we have this book that, best explains what's happening. But that leads us to a point that maybe the naturalists don't want to get to. They don't want to confront that because obviously it's the black swan to their theory.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, in a way, the Jewish people entirely are a black swan to their theory, which is the greater theme of the article, right? But
Yeah.
Daniel sort of exemplifies it in a way that really I don't know that any other book necessarily does. Maybe Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy, especially Deuteronomy 28, with the prophecies of blessings and cursings that certainly do end up coming to pass, right? But the thing about Daniel is it's not just one chapter, right? It's all throughout the entire book constantly. And even Daniel's own life itself kind of exemplifies it, right? Being somebody who's kidnapped and then going to be, a high-ranking member of the Babylonian court, and then a high-ranking member even after that of the Persian court for the very last part of his life, allowing him to publish the Book of Daniel in such a way that it would be around, right, and that people would know about it. His name is probably relatively popular. I mean, I'm 100% convinced we'll probably find some archaeological evidence of. I don't think we'll find him as called Daniel. It'll probably be Balthazar, but eventually that stuff is going to have to come up because it's just he's so well established in the narrative, right? And we know, of course, even like for example, Ezekiel, that was something that was written at the time, and everybody acknowledges that it was written at the time, right? And Ezekiel makes specific reference to Daniel, so we do know he's out and about at the time, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And that's the thing about our case. We have persons of interest, even if they're like, well, that may not be the person. Okay, well, I may give you that, but we have a person of interest. But your whole theory relies on an imaginary person. Sometime around 170, 160, 150 BC, coming up with this book, distributing it to all the synagogues, getting the Orthodox, the Maccabees, who were fighting against any type of Hellenic influence in the Jewish, to just go ahead and allow this forgery to come in. So there's no person of interest on their side. There's no historical reference. I mean, there's nothing in any of the Jewish records or the Persian records. And remember, Greeks were reading these books. They were hearing this throughout Greek-speaking synagogues. The God-fearers who weren't totally on board, they heard this and they had no issue with this. Obviously, they'd be the ones, which goes back to my argument in the article. That's a saying it's conclusive, but it's the dog that didn't bark. And we see this throughout, you know, the dog that did not bark. And I like that, you know, kind of view, because it's a legal argument. You would expect people to come out and say, this is all wrong. And you had the areas to come out and say it. The Suclids, they were out there. So a lot of the members of the family, the Ptolemies were there. 2nd century AD, they build this new library out over there. So there was obviously reference here, and there's no mention of any dispute coming out of this that what is being said here is incorrect, which these are expected responses that we'd see. There's tons of anti-Semitism. There was a lot of attacks on the Jewish people, their works. Why not this one until Porphyry of Tyre, in the 3rd century?
Yeah, absolutely. And so real quick, I just want to acknowledge a few new people in the chat. Timothy and Brother Nicholas, thank you both for being here. I think that's everybody, actually. Yeah, I think that's the only 2 new people I've seen in the chat. Thank you guys very much for being here, and shalom. And so, yeah, it's just something that we see demonstrated again, right, all the way throughout, even past the point. And I love, Jamie Russell actually posted, I love how even 150 is a big problem. And it's like, it's true, right? It's like you can, even at the point that you are forced to concede, namely 150, you still have everything that happened with Rome that is specifically prophesied in Daniel 2, everything that happened with the Messiah and so on that we have in Daniel 9. All the message that we have all throughout Daniel 11 and Daniel 7 and just so on and so forth. You know what I mean? And really it could, we could actually go in if we wanted to be like exegetical about this, and maybe even one day we should go through specifically verse by verse, and show people how it lines up with the history. But of course, that's not the specific topic for today as much as the debate and articles are, right?
Yeah, but it ties back to, the destiny of the Jewish people. And we find this book that seems to correlate really well with history.
Mhm.
Even after their so-called 150 AD date, there's all these other things that they have to explain, especially in reference to the destruction of the temple, the Roman Empire, the cutoff of the Messiah. So there's lots of other things that they have to explain. So they do not even get away with it with their theory. I think what we find a lot is a dismissive nature of the Jewish records, and yeah, we just don't believe in that silliness anymore. So we could just discount all of it. But if you think about it, this is not engaging an observable black swan to their theory, which, it's, your presupposition is preventing you from actually engaging. Didn't say you have to jump to the God hypothesis, but where is the engagement in these theories? This is why, oh, well, Alexander couldn't have seen the book because it was written in 150, but it's a
Mhm.
way they dismiss and not have to deal with the evidence.
Absolutely. And so I want to read really quick a quote that you put at the very beginning of your article. And it comes from, and I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, but I
Nikolai
believe,
Berdyaev.
yeah, Nikolai Berdyaev. And this is, I think, a very interesting thing to hear. I'm gonna actually throw it on the screen really quick so that
Yeah,
everybody
no,
else can
sounds
read it
good.
as well. Um, let's go ahead and share here. All right, share system. I guess I don't have to share the system audio, but nonetheless. So this quote right here, I think, is one of the more interesting quotes that I've ever read, and I hope you guys can actually read it. So, in The Meaning of History, the once Marxist Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev provides a thorough explanation as to why he abandons the naturalistic interpretation of history. Now, go ahead and check this quote out, guys. This is a very interesting thing for him to say. Quote, I remember how the materialist interpretation of history, when I attempted in my youth to verify it by applying it to the destinies of people, broke down in the case of the Jews, where destiny seemed absolutely inexplicable from the materialistic standpoint. Excuse me. Oh, wow. Excuse me again. And indeed, according to the materialistic and positivist criterion, the people ought long ago to have perished. Its survival is a mysterious and wonderful phenomenon, demonstrating that the life of this people is governed by a special predetermination, transcending, the process of adaptation expounded by the materialist interpretation of history. The survival of the Jews, their resistance to destruction, their endurance under absolutely peculiar conditions, and the faithful role played by them in history, all of these point to the particular and mysterious foundations of their destiny. The history of the Jews is not only a phenomenon, it is I don't know how to pronounce this word, but I think it's a noumenon. The peculiarity of Jewish destiny consists in its, and I'm also going to probably pronounce this one incorrectly, honestly, incommiserability with either the pre-Christian or Christian era. Scientific criticism applied to traditional biblical history can neither discredit the universal role played by the Jews nor offer a satisfactory explanation of their mysterious destiny, end quote. And is that not the absolute truth? You know what I mean? When we're talking about these sort of things, and we've been talking a bunch about Daniel, right? But you can even move beyond Daniel, right? Like these people being destroyed and somehow managing to have their text preserved, their language preserved, their priesthood preserved,
Their
their
religion.
tradition preserved. Yeah, exactly. Their religion, their ethnic identity, and even in various places, right? The Ashkenazi Jew in Germany, in Poland and Russia and all that kind of stuff, and the Sephardic Jew, which is typically found in France and Spain and all that kind of stuff, and Mizrahi Jews, which are all over in the Middle East, and African Jews and Orientalist Jews. They all have the same customs, the same language,
Mm-hmm.
the same traditions, the same religion. You know what I mean? It's an incredibly peculiar situation, especially when you consider we have tons of other groups that we can look at. For example, the Assyrians, they exist to this day, sort of. I say sort of because they blended with the Aramaeans and also took a lot of the different things from the Arabs until now we don't actually call them Assyrian or Aramaic, we call them Syriac because they are functionally a different culture, right? They have different traditions. Their religion is now Christianity, a very specific flavor of Christianity. They don't speak the same language, so on and so forth, right? They don't even have the same like general culture at all. Now, do they exist in an ethnic sense? Well, sure, but that's not really. And Assyria is this mighty, powerful people, and the Jews are just this little strip of New Jersey-sized land, and yet one of them is clearly demonstrating this destiny throughout history, and the other one very clearly is not, right? And I think and you can do that constantly throughout tons of other examples, but I just think it's a very interesting thing for us to look at. And I can, sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, and you see this with Egypt as well, and because it's interesting. Dr. Carrier brought up the Egyptians. Well, their religion is gone, their language is gone. They lost their religion several times over, not only to Christianity but now to Islam. So they've lost their language, they lost their religion. They never really got pushed off the land and came back and reconstituted it, but they've lost everything. And I know he brought up the Hindus too, but they've lost their language. They don't have their language anymore. But with the Jews, they do. And that's why I kind of introduced the Mark Twain quote afterwards in the article, because he goes into that too. The Jews saw them all, and the Jews beat them all. All these big, the Babylonians, the Persians, and that's another group, lost their language, they lost their religion. They're not the same group. They don't have their cultures anymore. So you see this with all these people, but not with the Jews. And you're right. They share the same language, where all these other groups have lost it. And, they are the statistical anomaly in this whole equation. And what best explains that but the scriptures?
Absolutely. And remember, this is one of those things that not only has it troubled numerous different non-theists, right? But there's a whole group of people, multiple groups of people in Islamist circles, in white supremacist circles, in just straight anti-Zionist circles who have recognized this, and they think of it as like a problem, right? In other words, it's like it's so obvious that it's almost like when we don't have the right God hypothesis, right, so to speak, we come to these crazy conclusions because of course it's obvious, right? We see it everywhere. I think like 4 of the top 5 richest people on the planet are Jewish right now, right? Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. And it's exactly the case. What best explains this constant blessing and cursing, this survival, the reestablishment of the state, all this kind of stuff.
Twice.
Yeah, exactly. And, I mean, even to the point of like, you think of holidays, right? Pesach, otherwise known as the Passover, having existed now for 3,400 years. And it's the same holiday that Moses himself ended up celebrating and instituting, right? Or even Hanukkah itself, right? The Festival of Lights.
Yeah, it's been around since the Maccabean period, after that period.
That's almost 2,200 years at this point, right? It was established 164 BC. It's now 2021. So we're 15 years away from 2,100 years celebrating the same holiday as the people who reinstituted. We have Christmas right now, right? And don't get me wrong, we still celebrate the same general idea as the early Christians, right? But it's absolutely not the same holiday, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It is amongst some, to be fair, amongst the devout, I think it is. But amongst like the secular culture, it's a completely different thing. We got Santa Claus, which never existed back then. We got, polar bears on Coke bottles and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And don't get me wrong, there's very clearly a Destinarian nature to the Christian church as well. And hopefully we'll get to that on another episode at some point. But the point just being like from a cultural perspective, you can look at holidays as exemplary of this. You can look at the establishment of their wealth. You can look at curses. You can look at the land. You can look at the language. There's just so many different elements that you can look at. And I think it's a very interesting, very important thing for us to look at here, especially as it plays into our own faith, because, of course, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, right? So, of course, we would expect these things to be true because they are the chosen people of God, and it is us being grafted in to the Israel, to the nation of Israel, right? Spiritually speaking, that allows us to be saved by the Jewish Messiah, right? And so very interesting things to talk about. Is there anything I am currently missing right now as far as our go through on the whole thing?
No, I think we went through, and then you capturing on that last point from the article at the very beginning, which really lays the background argument. Here's what we're seeing. Yeah, in 330 BC, it's just another significant event in the history of the Jews that they should have been wiped out given the circumstances that befell them. Um, they should have never went back to Jerusalem after that. So it's all these mysterious foundations of their destiny um, that really it makes us ask, what is why are these people immortal and everyone else isn't? So I think obviously the introductory quote kind of sums up the basis of the argument, which Daniel is basically, which is the major theme of the book of Daniel.
Mm-hmm. And real quick, I do want to answer a few quick points here. So we see number one, Jamie Russell asks, I am not closed to God doing a mighty work for Jews, but can we still call the Jewish religion today the same as in the Bible? They're I don't know what this word is, to be honest. I think that's a typo. And they don't have the same theme or sacrifices. I think it's they don't accept their Savior and they don't have the themes and sacrifices is probably what's meant to be communicated here. But anyways, a couple different things I would want to answer on this, and then I want to pass it to you and give you opportunity to answer as well. First thing is it does depend a little bit on what you mean as far as the same religion is concerned. This is an important point to make, certainly. The Jewish religion as it's practiced today is the same as the Jewish religion as was practiced by the Pharisees in Jesus' time and before. That is certainly accurate to say. Now, you can only go back that far because the temple is destroyed, right? And so a lot of the practices of the Jewish people are currently not actually being practiced in that sense. There's also a reason that you have to only say that, and that is because the oral tradition is something added specifically by the rabbis in the Sanhedrin, and that creates rabbinic Judaism as we know it today, which could also be termed Pharisaic Judaism. However, there is also a subsect of the Jewish people that has always practiced what would be the continuation of the Israelite religion, sans the oral law, and of course sans temple practices because there's no temple, and that is what is known as Karaite Jews. There's actually a point in time during the 1000s AD that Karaite Jews were the predominant Jews, and they're considered to be the ones who are responsible for the preservation of the Masoretic text. They're considered to be the ones who are responsible for the establishment of the Tiberian vowel system, which is how we speak modern Hebrew today. And so they have all of these different elements of, clearly being influential on the Jewish people as we stand to this day, and still following what was the established faith at the time, right? So that's the first thing that's certainly important to point out. The second thing that's certainly important to point out is when we talk about rejection of the Savior. Now, here you have to differentiate between two different elements, right? If you're talking about the faith being practiced as it was at the time, that still ends up being true, right? But if you mean the Bible is supposed to be blooming into this fully formed flower, if you will, that is the New Testament, and they certainly didn't do that. That definitely is true, though it's not entirely true. There's always been a remnant of Messianic Jews. And not only were the apostles Messianic Jews, but of course we've seen them surviving up until this day. Excuse me. Sorry, I just had a little bit of a weird thing here on my computer. But so while we do see that has been continued in and of itself in a literal sense, also we do have to understand that is different than saying the religion as it was established at the time is still being practiced, right? Because the religion as it was established at the time is not something that we as Christians can practice, right? Because we do have revelation of Messiah. There's a lot of things we can still practice about it. Reading the Old Testament, living a moral life. Obviously, a lot of people celebrate the holidays. I'm not opposed to that. In fact, this next cycle, I think I'm going to be celebrating the holidays myself because I see no reason not to. Not as a religious thing, but just because, they're holidays, right? Well, might as well celebrate. But nonetheless, this isn't the same thing as saying they aren't saying that that their religion today is the same as the Bible in that sense, right? It's a nuanced issue in that particular regard. And then there's one last thing I would want to point out in this too, which is you always have to remember the Bible specifically says that God keeps his promises even in spite of what people do against him. And a perfect example of this as it pertains to our conversation is in Ezekiel. Ezekiel actually specifically says, I will bring the people of Israel back, even though they profane my name. Not because they don't profane my name, but because I will not profane my name. In other words, I told Moses, I told Abraham, I told Isaac and Jacob and David and so on that I was going to bless them. And so even though the Jewish people are not keeping their end of the bargain, I'm still going to keep my end of the bargain. And I think that's Ezekiel 36, right? So a lot of stuff to say there, but then Jonathan, go ahead and answer with everything you'd like to say as well.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of that is they still have the same scriptures. So they're still following the same scriptures that they have historically done. And I think, when we look back to obviously the first century in Jesus's time, Jesus recognizes the same Hebrew canon that we do today. And that's the canon that they've been following throughout. Yeah, obviously, with the destruction of the temple, there's been some changes to their liturgical service and how they worship. But they are basically the same group, holding to basically the same teachings and views and their scriptures that we have today. They've always been, a group of different sects, as we've seen in the first century between the House of Shemel. So we do see these divergent groups, but they follow the same scriptures. A lot of time they're following most of the same stuff. So I wouldn't see any difference. But going back to your point, Jay, it still goes back to you still see the same blessings that are being bestowed upon them due to God's promise.
Yeah, and just to give a real specific example before we move on, the Levitical priesthood is alive and well today, right? We've managed to, via genetics, prove that. And if you've ever met a Kahana or a Cohen or a Koch or anybody along those lines who had that kind of a last name, right? You'll notice they probably had a family history of being rabbis. And the reason is because those people are actually descendant of the tribe of Levi. And again, whereas that was tradition for a very long time, we've actually managed to prove that genetically at this point. And there is actually, even right now, as we speak, a fully functional, fully trained, ready to operate in the temple once it's built, Levitical priesthood. I believe they had their first graduating class in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. The Temple Mount movement has been, which is Yehuda Glick's group, has been, training them over the last couple of years once they figured out genetically that this was legit and all that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, we as Christians are not submitted to the Levitical priesthood, right? Jesus fulfilled the Levitical priesthood, and, so that's not something that we have to submit ourselves to, listen to, all that kind of stuff. We're not doing sacrifices in the temple. We're not having to go to the temple to be where God abides, all this other kind of stuff, right? However, it is still true that the Jewish people are blessed, and also that God said he would establish the Levitical priesthood forever, right? Which at least would mean until the end of our earthly life, right? Well, did God negate on that promise to bless the Jewish people and to establish the Levitical priesthood forever? Well, obviously not, right? Because we do have the records here of these of the Levitical priesthood existing even to this day. And so, you know, the point, I guess, just kind of stands there in that, you know, we see two things can be true at once in this particular instance, right? It can be true that the Jews are currently following a false religion because they are stuck in the time before Christ, while also being true that God is true to his word. He blessed the Jewish people. He established the Levitical priesthood, and they are going to continue on in that sense. Now, there is a point here I want to address really quick because it's important to what I just brought up. Nicholas asks, aren't they only Aaronic priests? And there's no real way to determine whether or not they're Aaronic or Levitical in general. Now, obviously, all Aaronic priests are Levitical, right? But not necessarily all members of the tribe of Levi would be Aaronic, right? So the way that they did the testing is they looked at all the different people, right? Cohen, Kahana, all that other kind of stuff, right? And basically, they were able to determine that they all had the same Y chromosome dating back to a single male ancestor roughly 3,000 to 3,500 years ago, right? That would be consistent both with them being specifically the Aaronic priesthood and more generally the Levitical priesthood, right? So you can't really get any more specific than that. It's possible they could all be descendants of Aaron. It's possible they could just be more generally descendants of the tribe of Levi. Obviously, either way, all descendants of Aaron are descendants of Levi, right? So to an extent, it ends up being half moot in a sense. But that is essentially the answer to the question, Nicholas. There's no real way at this point, at least, for us to prove anything more specific. Now, I think that it is probably more general on the basis that when you look at the last names, Cohen, Kahana, Koch, all that other kind of stuff, right? They are derivatives of the Hebrew word Cohen. In fact, one of them is just simply the Hebrew word Cohen. And that word just simply means a priest, which would apply to all of the Levitical priesthood, not specifically one family or another. Whereas you would call him the Rosh Cohen as far as the high priest, right? Now, obviously, I don't know if they would have Rosh Cohen as a last name. It doesn't appear that anybody does. But I just think that on the basis of that, it does appear to me that this is more of a general thing than a sort of a high priesthood thing. But it's a great question. It's a great question. And it also, I hope it just answered the question that Jamie had as far as did they date it with Levite testable DNA? We don't have somebody who is obviously, alive from that time. But what we are able to establish is they all have the same male ancestor dating back to the relevant time, and it's Middle Eastern, right? Or Levantine is the more specific way to put it. So yeah. Sorry. Anybody else have anything they want to say here? And I'm sorry, but I think I got confused there for a moment. I was talking about talking about anybody on the live chat, but any comment you want to have there as well. Question is about the priesthood requiring Aaronites. The other Levites were not priests, were they? No, all of the Levites were priests. The other Levites were not high priests. So the way that it works out, right, is the entire tribe of Levi ends up being the priestly caste, right? And that in and of itself is actually split into three more specific families of Levitical priesthood, each with their own specific duties under the law of Moses. Then there is another subsect of this group, right? Another specific section of this group, which is the descendants of Aaron, and they are the high priests, right? So first off, the actual high priest has to be an Aaronite, right? So that is one of the big portions of that. And this actually is important to your question. It is true that the inner workings of the temple, according to the law of Moses, could only actually be done by Aaronites, right? So in other words, while the Levitical priesthood has a whole bunch of priestly duties they have to do, sacrifice on the altar, which is outside of the temple, if you guys recall correctly, and washing and all this other kind of stuff, right? The Aaronites are the only ones who can actually operate inside the temple proper, right? And do things like Yom Kippur, where they're going in, talking about atonement, go into the Holy of Holies, all that other kind of stuff. Now, where this becomes relevant for today is that right now, since they're not any more specific than just general Levites, you can't really have a legitimate, Toraically speaking, or mosaically speaking, if you'd prefer, high priesthood, right? And we don't really know how the Jewish people plan to get around that, if they plan to get around that with the establishment of this new priesthood. But nonetheless, that is sort of the answer to your question, brother, as far as whether or not the Levites were all priests and the priesthood requiring Aaronites. The priesthood, according to the Torah, absolutely requires Aaronites. Whether or not it will in this new reiteration, I'm not 100% sure. But nonetheless, the Levites were still general, the priestly tribe. And in fact, they had no land as a result, right? They ended up having to live specifically off of the tribute and tithe given by the rest of the tribes, which is why we render the tribes as 12 and not 13. If you actually counted it all out, you'd notice, because Joseph is not a tribe, right? It's split into two tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. Well, if you have no tribe of Joseph, but two tribes in place of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim, then that actually gives you 13 tribes of Israel, not 12 tribes of Israel, right? Well, the reason we only render it 12 tribes of Israel is because the Levitical tribe is only a priest tribe. They don't have any land. They don't have any political sway, all that other kind of stuff. So I hope that answered the question there. And anything you want to add, brother, you can certainly add.
Oh, no, I think you handled that pretty well.
Awesome. And so with that, we are just getting past 2 hours here. So I think we might go ahead and wrap up. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience today, brother?
No, definitely go check out the articles. I think bigger than the book of Daniel is the worldview discussion. The naturalists, against the biblical worldview. So, and the goal of this was to really shed light on the problems of the naturalistic worldview in having to satisfactorily explain a lot of these particular junctures in history, and specifically relating to the Jews. But once again, there's lots more others that apply to Christianity that they cannot explain from a naturalistic perspective. And so the whole heart of this conversation was really to focus on that, particularly on the book of Daniel and the strange circumstances around Jerusalem's survival, once again in history, at the time of Alexander.
Absolutely. And links to all of the different relevant sources are in the live chat now. I'm going to go ahead and drop them again. But the first thing I'm going to drop here will be a link to the conversation on myth vision, followed by a link to Jonathan's article, which is actually pinned at the top also, followed by a link to Dr. Carrier's article. And then lastly, but not leastly, I'll provide a link to our brother Jonathan's channel, just in case you guys aren't able to find those. They're all floating around the live chat right now. But, obviously digging through the live chat can be difficult sometimes and kind of annoying also. So I'll just go ahead and drop everything in right now. We're going to go ahead and close out, friends. I was going to think about opening the room, but that ended up kind of giving a solid 2 hours. So what we might do at some point is maybe have another episode where it's just an open room and you guys can kind of come in, ask some questions to Jonathan about the conversations and all that kind of stuff. That could certainly be an important episode to have, but I don't know if we'll maybe do that. We'll maybe not. We'll see what ends up happening. But I think this was certainly a great conversation. And if you guys agreed, please do remember to like and share this video. Get this video out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? While you're there, please do consider getting an account with some of these alternative social media platforms. If you want to fight against big tech censorship, you don't want the government to do it. You don't want it to get in the hands of your enemies and be an echo chamber and all that kind of stuff. You want to utilize it yourself using our capitalist system. So get an account here, share this video there, follow your boy, make it less of an echo chamber. Also, if you guys like this content, please consider subscribing. Please hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. And also, if you would like to help contribute financially to help me turn this into a career, you can certainly do so by going to our Patreon. Link there is also floating around in the live chat. If you guys watch the majority of this video, that is the number one thing you can do for the algorithm. So I appreciate you. And keep both me and Brother Jonathan in your prayers, because that is the number one thing you can do for us, period, right? We serve a prayer-answering God. And, of course, lastly, gentlemen and ladies, we were joined by a guest today. So please do check out Jonathan Sheffield's channel. There is a lot of awesome content there. He doesn't post very frequently, but that's because he has a lot of work that he does in these channels. I mean, it's like full animations. There's voices. I mean, it's all really great. You should definitely check it out. And also make sure to follow a lot of his debates because they're absolutely fantastic. Anything else you want to add here before we get out?
No, that's it. But hopefully me and Jay will be doing some big stuff in the future. So hopefully to get some things worked out.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some things currently in the works, but I won't go ahead and announce them quite yet just because they're not established. But just note, we do have some things in the works here, and by the grace of God, we'll have them established here. So, shalom, friends. Thank you very much for being here today. God bless you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And if he wills and tarries, we will see you here soon.